But fortunately, I have Lucretius who can help me to deal with my dread in a better way. In his work, The Nature of Things, Lucretius argues that in order to best work through my fear and anxiety, I should engage in rational thought instead of in superstitious thinking. He argues that I should practice philosophy rather than religion. Now, recall from Professor Donahue's lecture that in footnote 9, Stallings tells us that for the Latin term religio, she uses the terms religion and superstition and uses them interchangeably. Stallings explains that Lucretius is not against piety, but against the evils of organized religion. Similarly, in the Lucretius entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, David Sedley writes that although the Latin word religio is correctly translated into English as religion, its literal meaning is binding down, and it therefore serves Lucretius as a term not for all attitudes of reverence towards the divine, but for those which cow people's spirits, rather than, as Lucretius thinks such attitudes should, elevate people to a joyful state of tranquility. So, according to Sedley, when Lucretius formulates arguments against religion, he isn't so much attempting to prove that there are no supernatural gods. Instead, he's arguing against the way that mystical belief can make us more afraid and more anxious. Lucretius is well aware that most people thought, indeed, many still think, that it's philosophy that will make us more fearful, in part because philosophy can lead to the belief that when we die, we turn into worm food and dust, and nothing about us survives. And, well, most people are afraid of not existing anymore. Add to that the fact that if we turn into worm food and nothing about us survives the death of the body, in fact, if the earth and everything on it will at some point no longer exist, then many people will feel that life has no meaning. I mean, why work so hard to write a book, to win a gold medal in the Olympics, to find a vaccine for some contagious disease, if this tiny little speck in this incredibly vast universe will at some point be just a bunch of cosmic dust with nothing left to prove that we were ever even here? And Lucretius also understood that most people thought, and many still think, that without religion there can be no morality. For if there are no supernatural beings watching over everyone and no ultimate punishment for any wrongdoing, then we can, and many will, do many bad things if we can get away with them. But Lucretius believes that it is religion and not philosophy that instills fear in people. In particular, he argues that religions instill fear when they suggest that there's an afterlife where some people will suffer for eternity. Lucretius also believes that religion sometimes encourages immoral actions and can persuade us to do terrible things. He provides the example of human sacrifice in the name of religion. And even if one argues that contemporary religions no longer endorse human sacrifice, it's not that difficult to come up with some horrible acts done by the authority of and in the name of religion. In any case, Lucretius argues that although many believe that it's philosophy that will lead to anxiety and immorality, and that only religion can lead to serenity and decency, Lucretius argues it's actually the other way around. So pause to read this slide. I mentioned footnote 9 earlier. In footnote 12, Stallings writes that the last line in the quote, "So potent was religion in persuading to do wrong," is, quote, one of the most famous lines in the poem. Again, although it's not that difficult to see that human sacrifice is pretty bad, and it's not that difficult to come up with some other examples of the way that religion encourages, or at least doesn't discourage, immoral actions, Lucretius recognizes that most people still accept a religious explanation of the universe and the beginning of life. But, he argues, most do so only because of the fear that is put into them by doomsayer prophets who claim that we will be punished for eternity if we don't believe what they preach. A prophecy that rests upon the assumption that each of us has a soul that will survive the death of our body. So pause to read this slide. As Professor Donahue explained, Lucretius thinks that fear is the reason why people believe the religious explanation that we have an immortal soul that will survive the death of the body and could be punished for eternity. We don't know what's going to happen when we die, and that uncertainty results in fear. And just as that article that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture suggested, in the face of uncertainty, people will latch on to any explanation rather than remain in a state of uncertainty. And as we saw in Professor Dardis's lecture on the Phaedo, one of the most popular explanations concerning death is the mystical explanation involving an immortal soul. Lucretius also explains that fear is the main reason why so many people accept the religious explanation for natural phenomena, like hurricanes and massive storms with lightning and thunder, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, infestation, and of course, plagues. All such events are scary, and they may seem to come out of nowhere. They cause damage to crops and homes, resulting in injury and death. Lucretius explains that the fear that results from natural phenomena, along with the lack of an adequate natural explanation of them, causes people to turn to supernatural explanations. He writes, "All humans are in the clutches of dread, beholding many things take place in heaven overhead, or here on earth, whose causes they can't fathom, they assign the explanation for these happenings to powers divine." We in the 21st century have the ability to explain and even predict many of these phenomena. But imagine what it would be like to have an earthquake or tornado come out of seemingly nowhere. One moment you're hanging out with your friends and family, and the next moment the skies turn black, and suddenly there's a funnel cloud that destroys everything. The uncertainty about why that tornado occurred and the fear that it could happen again without any notice would turn even the most skeptical among us towards at least some explanation that we could hold on to. And if well respected, venerable people told us that if we just practice certain rituals and perhaps even sacrifice a lamb or two in order to prevent a tornado from happening again, and if they told us that if we failed to do the correct ritual and sacrifice, that the gods will then send down a tornado 5 times as strong just when we least expect it, well, it wouldn't surprise any of us if a bunch of people began to engage in the ritual sacrifice of sacrificing those poor little lambs just to be on the safe side, thinking, hey, what have we got to lose? So Lucretius wants to dispel the fear of natural phenomena. And his cure for that fear is philosophy, that is, the engagement in rational thought based on observation and experience in order to better understand ourselves and the world around us. Such an understanding would replace our uncertainty and would help to ease fear that results from it. And if people could understand the way that the natural world really works by learning about the underlying laws of nature, they would not only be able to better understand the causes of natural phenomena, but they would be able to better predict them and better prepare for them. So pause to read this slide. We can see in these last 2 lines that Lucretius also believes that philosophy will help to cure the fear of death and the fear of eternal suffering in an afterlife. Lucretius believes that if people could understand that the soul is physical and mortal, they could be certain that they would not survive the death of the body and would no longer fear death, let alone an eternity of suffering. So let's take a look at what Lucretius says about the soul. Remember from Professor Dardis's lecture that Socrates and Plato argue that we each of us have a non-physical soul that will survive the death of our body. But remember also Professor Dardis's assessment of the arguments in the Phaedo that attempt to show that the soul is immortal. Professor Dardis suggests that many of those arguments don't quite work to adequately prove that the soul is immortal. And Lucretius would agree with Professor Dardis's assessment. Now, Lucretius agrees that everyone has a soul, but he believes that the soul is a physical entity that will not survive the death of the body. And because a dead body will decay and decompose back into atoms, the soul will too. So when we apply reason, the fear and anxiety about hell and the afterlife will be dispelled, because we'll come to see that we don't have an immortal soul that goes to heaven or hell or anywhere else when we die, and so there can be no fear of any eternal suffering. This dread, these shadows of the mind, must be swept away, not by rays of sun nor by the brilliant beams of day, but by observing nature and her laws. Lucretius encourages us to observe nature and the things around us, and when we combine those observations with reason, we'll discover the first principle of philosophy, that nothing's brought forth by any supernatural power out of naught. In other words, nothing comes from nothing. Not even a supernatural being can create something out of nothing. Lucretius then provides many, many different arguments supporting the claim that nothing on earth was created by a supernatural entity. Most of his arguments aim to show that if things could be created from nothing, then there would be some really crazy stuff going on. A newborn person would just pop out of the sea. Apple trees would all of a sudden produce pears, and all other sorts of random things would happen, like these. Pause here to read them. We don't ever see a beetle giving birth to an elephant, an apple tree producing a pear, or Hofstra's tulips appearing in December. And we don't see things coming to be in this way because things are not created out of nothing. Instead, each thing on earth comes from something, and whatever that something is, it must be natural. And just as nothing can come from nothing, so too what exists can never turn into nothing. For Lucretius writes, nature does not render anything to naught. Everything that is destroyed or dies is reduced back to its elemental particles again. As Professor Donahue explained, Lucretius believes that the elemental particles are material atoms, and he argues that those atoms must be eternal, because if the atoms weren't eternal, then that would mean that there was a point in time when they didn't exist and there was nothing. But since nothing comes from nothing, if there was ever nothing, there would still be nothing now. So pause to read this slide. When we follow reason, we come to see that everything is made of atoms, and the atoms are natural, material, and eternal. And it is because of what matter is and the fact that it behaves according to the laws of nature that nature cannot make a man so large that he could wade across the deep to other lands, mighty enough to wrench apart great mountains with his hands and outlive generations. Lucretius believes that because the principle something can't come from nothing is true, it cannot be the case that God's created the universe and everything in it from nothing. Lucretius explains instead that atoms always existed. We'll pause to read this slide. Notice that these last few lines, in which Lucretius explains that the atoms combined in many different ways until they eventually came to combine in the way that we see things now, sounds like an early version of the theory of evolution. So in the first book of his poem, Lucretius argues that many superstitious and religious beliefs will be proven to be not only false, but the source of unfounded fear. And when we apply reason, we discover that the universe cannot be created or destroyed by any god or gods, and is instead ultimately determined by a fundamental principle, that something can't come from nothing. And when we apply further reasoning to that principle, we will find that we can predict earthquakes, hurricanes, and even pandemics. And with that ability, the fear that results from the uncertainty about the future is dispelled. So we've seen that Lucretius believes that philosophical reasoning will help us to discover the truth. He ends book 1 with this. Pause to read this slide. One of the truths that will be illuminated as light kindles light is the truth that death is not something to be feared. In other words, Lucretius believes that philosophy can help us out of the personal crisis that is the fear of death. The fear of death. I'll discuss his reasoning in the next video.